Hey up, how's the doing? You alright? What was that I just said? Did you understand it? No, I wasn't speaking a different language. That was me saying the equivalent of, Hi, how are you? Hope you're doing well. But in the Yorkshire dialect. Would you say that sounded like a British accent? It's maybe not the accent you'd expect when you think of a British accent, but about 8% of the population of the UK come from Yorkshire, so it's one of the most common accents in the country. Not all British people have the same accent, and we certainly don't all sound like the Queen. There's really no such thing as a British accent. There are many different British accents, and that's what we're going to be learning about today. So, today's objectives are for me to show you the huge number of different accents we have across the UK. We'll look at why the UK has so many different accents, and introduce you to some of the ones that you're most likely to hear when you listen to British English speakers. So, let's get started with the question. What is a British accent? Well, to think about this, let's first have a think about what we mean when we're talking about the UK. The letters UK stand for United Kingdom, because our nation is actually made up of more than one country. So my first question to you is, how many countries do you think there are in the UK? And do you think you can name them all? Have a think, and then we'll move on to the next slide and have a look. Ready? The UK is actually made up of 4 separate countries. The largest country is England, with a population of about 56 million people. Next up, we have Scotland, with a population of about 5.5 million people, and then Wales, with 3 million people, and finally Northern Ireland, with about 2 million people. Altogether, these 4 countries make up the UK, or to give it its full name, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This is why England and the UK are not the same thing. All English people are from the UK. All English people are British. But not all British people are English. If you call a Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish person English, they might actually be quite offended. The thing is, each of these countries have their own cultures, and part of that can be seen in the very different accents you hear in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's normally very easy for another British person to tell which of the 4 countries someone comes from, just based on their accent. So, if you say you want to learn a British accent, it's not really a simple question. Which British accent would you like to learn? English? Scottish? Welsh? Northern Irish? And even within each of these countries, there isn't just one accent. Let's take the example of England. I've got a famous quote on the screen now from the Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw. He said, "It is impossible for an Englishman to open his mouth without making some other Englishman hate or despise him." But what do you think he meant when he said this? Is it that all English people hate each other? No, he was making a joke about the assumptions English people make about other English people based on their accent and the way they talk. English people make a lot of assumptions about where someone comes from based on the way they speak. And when I say where someone comes from, I don't just mean the place in the country that they come from, but also the social class that they come from. And sometimes these assumptions can be positive, and sometimes they can be negative. But the point Bernard Shaw was trying to make is that even though there are so many different accents and ways of speaking, none of them are any better or worse than any other one. If you were to go to a rich country estate in the south of England with a northern working class accent, then people might think that you didn't really fit in there. But equally, if you went to a small working class town in the north of England with a southern upper class accent, you'd probably find it just as difficult to fit in. There are often news articles in the UK about surveys that have been taken of British people about how they feel about different accents. And every accent seems to have many different good and bad associations for British people. For example, people with a Newcastle accent, which is the accent from the city where I studied for my undergraduate and master's degrees, it's often associated with being very friendly, but also less formal and less polite. Whereas speaking with an RP accent, a received pronunciation accent, an accent we'll be looking at in more detail in the next lesson, people often associate that accent with being well educated, but also with being less trustworthy and less kind. Of course, all these things are just stereotypes, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are many different English accents, and even more different British accents. The things that bring British people together isn't their accent, but their shared culture. A cup of tea, sarcastic humour, and self-deprecation are all much more British than having any particular accent. If speaking with a British accent is important to you, though, you just need to think about which sort of British accent and dialect it is that you enjoy listening to, and then you can try to learn that. You might have noticed I keep using that word, dialect. But what does it mean? And how is it different from accent? Let's have a look on the next slide. You've probably heard of accent before. It describes the way words are pronounced by a particular person or in a certain place. Well, accent is just one part of someone's dialect. Our dialect includes not only our accent, the way we pronounce the words themselves, but also differences in vocabulary and grammar between different people who speak the same language. It is often differences in dialect rather than just accent that can make people from different places difficult to understand, even when we're speaking the same language. And the UK has a lot of different dialects. In fact, we have the biggest diversity of both accents and dialects of any English-speaking country. So, how many recognised dialects do you think there are in the UK? Remember that each separate dialect will have differences in vocabulary and grammar as well as the accent. So how many do you think it is? In fact, the UK has at least 37 recognised and named dialects. That's a lot of different ways to speak British English. I've listed some of the most famous dialects from England on this slide. I really recommend, if you have the time, to go and search for some clips online of people speaking in these dialects to hear just how different they sound. Let's have a look at the first one. Cockney is a dialect that comes from East London. You're probably most likely to have heard the accent before in London gangster movies like Legend or Snatch. Although it is a famously difficult accent to copy, and lots of people struggle to get it right in movies. The most famous example is Dick Van Dyke in the original Mary Poppins, who sounded more like an Australian than a Cockney. Although, if you want to hear a real Cockney accent, the most famous example would probably be Michael Caine, who's been in over 150 TV series and films. Some features of the Cockney accent include dropping the letter H from the beginning of words. So, for example, horse would become horse. And also Cockneys completely replace the TH sound in words, the th, with either a th or a v. So the word thin could become thin, and the words they and them could become they and them. I'll just take a quick look through the next three dialects on the list. The next one is Scouse, which comes from the area around Liverpool. This is the accent you heard on the video clip before the start of this lesson. Probably the most famous people to have Scouse accents would have been the Beatles, the famous band from the 1960s and 70s. The Geordie dialect comes from Newcastle in the northeast of England. Two of Britain's most popular TV hosts, Ant and Dec, have a Geordie accent, along with many famous musicians and singers like Sting, Mark Knopfler, Cheryl Tweedy and Sam Fender. And finally we have Brummie, the dialect from Birmingham, the UK's second largest city. The Brummie dialect hadn't really been featured that much in popular culture, but it's been the main dialect used in the popular TV series Peaky Blinders and has been much more popular ever since. And those are just four of the many, many dialects in the UK. And because accent is just one part of dialect, there are many more different accents than there are dialects. Each city in the UK claims to have its own individual accent that is different from even their neighbouring cities. And there are 69 cities in the UK in total. You only have to look at the difference in accent between Liverpool, where they have the Scouse accent, and Manchester, where they have the Manc accent, to see the huge difference in accent in cities that are just 30 miles apart. Seriously, go and search for a Scouse accent and a Manc accent and just listen to the difference and then see how close those cities are. So we can divide up Britain's accents by city, but we can also do it by county as well. Most people where I'm from would say they have a Yorkshire accent rather than mentioning the city where they're from, or just saying they have a British accent. Then, of course, there are the differences in accent depending on whether you come from the city or the countryside, and the differences in accent based on your social class. Working class people will often have a different accent to upper class people or even middle class people from the same area. And in our modern times, most people don't live in the same place for their entire lives, moving to other areas for work or study, and picking up certain sounds and ways of pronouncing things from other areas. Really, everyone's accent is unique to them. There is no British accent. There are thousands of different British accents that often seem to be as different as they are the same. Let's have a look at an example that I am personally very familiar with. What is my accent? Well, I'd probably say I have either a Yorkshire accent or a general Northern English accent, which is often shortened to GNE. General Northern English is used to describe people who have a Northern English accent but don't use many of the local dialect features from the area they're from. So even though the way I pronounce words can sound quite Yorkshire sometimes, I don't use much specific vocabulary or grammar that's used by true Yorkshire dialect speakers. So to see why I have the accent that I do, you'd have to look at my personal history. I mean, my mum comes from Surrey in the south of England and speaks with a southern middle-class accent. My dad comes from a working-class family in Blackpool in the northwest of England, although he doesn't really have a strong accent. And I was born in Dover in the south of England, but I spent most of my childhood in Yorkshire. I've lived in Newcastle and Birmingham, as well as Taipei for university as well, so although my accent is mostly Yorkshire, I'll also have picked up different elements and bits from all of these different places. My accent also changes all the time depending on who I'm talking to. When I'm speaking to friends in Yorkshire, my Yorkshire accent will be much stronger and I'll use much more Yorkshire dialect vocabulary and grammar. But when I'm teaching or giving a lecture like I am now, my accent becomes much softer to make sure that I'm being clear to the maximum number of people. And that's just me. There are 67 million other people in the UK, so as you can imagine, that's going to be a lot of different accents. But why do you think the UK has so many different accents and dialects? If we think back to our last lesson, you might remember that the English language has been influenced and changed by lots of other languages. Everything from our vocabulary to our grammar and spelling has been changed by other languages over time. The thing is, these changes will have had more of an impact in some areas than others. Let's have a look at a map to help us out a little bit here. Like we learned in the last lesson, the history of the UK and the English language is the history of lots of different groups of people arriving onto these islands. Each of these groups, like Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings and Normans, changed the language that was spoken in these lands. The thing is, most of these groups had more impact in some parts of the UK than others. For example, the Celtish people and their languages were forced into the southwest, Wales and Scotland over time, leading these places to have a very different accent and dialect to other areas. There were also more Viking settlers in the east of the country, as they arrived by boat from northern Europe, so there's more Viking influence on the accents and dialects in the east of England. And this isn't something that just happened in the past. Accents change all the time. Local accents and dialects are constantly changing even today. When there is more contact with other places, cultures and languages, accents and dialects can change much, much faster. That's why port cities, cities on the coast where lots of ships come in and out, can often have very different dialects to other places in the same country. For example, the Scouse accent that you heard before this lesson is believed to have been influenced by Irish, Norwegian and Welsh immigrants who arrived in Liverpool from the docks. With the internet and all the media we now get in the UK from other English-speaking countries like America, Australia and Canada, accents and dialects are changing faster than ever before. Scholars are worried about some local accents disappearing altogether. The largest survey of English dialects was done by the University of Leeds in the 1950s and 1960s because they wanted to collect recordings of as many different accents and dialects as they could before they thought some of them would disappear. If you search online, you can still hear the recordings and listen to all of the different accents and dialects that were around in the UK 60 or 70 years ago. But with all this change over time, there are some accents that are not disappearing. There's some accents that are actually growing and growing quickly, being spoken by more and more people all the time. So let's have a look at some of those. Estuary English is the name of an accent that comes from the southeast of England. It's often shortened to just EE. It's one of the most common accents to hear on British TV and in other British media, and is becoming more popular all of the time. EE sounds like a combination of received pronunciation, an accent that we're going to be talking about a lot in the next few lessons, and the Cockney accent that we were just looking at earlier. Some people with Estuary English accents sound closer to received pronunciation and some sound closer to Cockney, but it's quickly becoming the standard accent across a lot of the south of England. Next up is an accent called Multicultural London English, or MLE for short. MLE, like Cockney, also comes from East London originally, and developed in multicultural areas where lots of young people with different cultural backgrounds mixed together and created a new accent. Famous music artists like Stormzy and actors like John Boyega have made the accent much more popular in recent years, with some words from the MLE dialect being used commonly by young people in other countries like Australia and even in non-native English-speaking countries like the Netherlands. The final accent we're going to look at that's growing really fast at the moment is one called General Northern English, which is what my accent would probably be described as. General Northern English is spoken by many people in the north of England that would previously have had a much more local regional accent. But over time, a lot of those regional accents have become more and more similar and more difficult to tell apart, so it's difficult to tell where somebody comes from. That doesn't mean that there aren't still lots of Northern English people with strong regional accents and dialects, just that there are more people now with a softer, more general Northern accent. So, after looking at all these different accents and dialects, I'm going to ask the same question that we started this lesson with. What is a British accent? Well, I think it's pretty clear now that there isn't a British accent. There are many British accents. And that's why this course works the way it does. We could teach you a British accent, but which one would we teach you? If you like my accent or Laura's accent, then please do try to learn that. But if there's another British accent that you like the sound of more, there's no problem if you want to learn that instead. If you're thinking of moving to the UK for study or work though, I'd recommend trying to find out what the local accent is wherever you're planning to be staying. That way you can become familiar with it before you move there. Other than that though, we believe it's much more important to learn about British culture than British accent, because then you'll be able to talk to British people much more naturally. So let's have a look back at what we've learned in this lesson. We've had a look at the amount of different accents there are in the UK and why there are so many different accents and dialects. We've also learned about the history of local dialects in Britain and learned what some of the most common accents are across the UK. Before we finish for today though, I wanted to introduce you to something from the Yorkshire dialect for our phrase of the day. So our phrase of the day for today is be right. It means it will be alright. So if hearing about all of these different British accents seems like a lot of information, don't worry. It will be right. And in the next lesson, it's going to be a lot more simple because we're only going to be looking at one accent called received pronunciation and often known as standard English. So we'll see you next time.